April 1976. A demolition crew arrived at the abandoned Riverside Theatre in Chicago's West Side, ready to tear down what had once been one of the city's most elegant performance venues. The building had stood empty for 13 years, its Art Deco facade crumbling, its windows boarded up, a monument to a bygone era, slowly surrendering to time and neglect. On the third day of demolition, as workers broke through a wall in the basement level, they discovered something that shouldn't exist. Behind layers of brick and plaster, hidden in a space that appeared on no architectural plans, they found a small room. And in that room, slumped in the corner, were human remains. If mysteries that haunt generations fascinate you, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happened to Ruth Thompson on November 3rd, 1961, will change how you think about the buildings we abandon and the secrets they keep. This is the story of a talented dancer who walked into a theater one autumn evening and never walked out. This is the story of a family that searched for 15 years. And this is the story of a discovery that would reveal a tragedy so preventable, so heartbreaking, that it would lead to changes in building safety codes across the country. Ruth Thompson was 28 years old in the fall of 1961, a woman who moved through the world with the distinctive grace that comes from a lifetime of dance. She stood 5 feet 6 inches, tall, slender but strong, with striking auburn hair that she usually wore pulled back in an elegant chignon. Her green eyes were expressive, reflecting every emotion with an intensity that made her a captivating performer. When Ruth danced, audiences couldn't look away. She had been born in Chicago in 1933, the youngest of 3 children in a middle-class Irish-American family. Her father, Patrick Thompson, worked as an accountant. Her mother, Margaret, had been a seamstress. Before marrying, they lived in a modest but comfortable home in the Rogers Park neighborhood, where Ruth had grown up watching Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers films at the local cinema, dreaming of one day dancing on a real stage. Ruth began ballet lessons at age 6 and never stopped. Through childhood and adolescence, dance was her passion, her escape, her purpose. She studied classical ballet, modern dance, tap, and jazz. By the time she was 18, she was performing with small dance companies around Chicago, earning modest pay but infinite satisfaction. Dance wasn't just what Ruth did. It was who she was. In 1955, at age 22, Ruth opened her own studio, Thompson Dance Academy, located on North Clark Street in the Lincoln Park neighborhood. The studio occupied the 2nd floor of an old brick building, with hardwood floors, wall-length mirrors, and windows that let in beautiful natural light. Ruth taught ballet to children, contemporary dance to teenagers, and ballroom to adults. She was known as a patient teacher, demanding but encouraging, with a gift for helping students discover their own grace. By 1961, Thompson Dance Academy had 50 regular students and a waiting list. Ruth had built something real, something lasting. She was making a living doing what she loved in the city she loved. Her life was, by most measures, exactly what she'd dreamed it would be. But Ruth wanted more. She wanted to perform. Teaching was fulfilling, but the stage called to her. She missed the spotlight, the audience, the electricity of live performance. So in addition to running her studio, Ruth regularly auditioned for local theater productions, particularly musical theater, where her dance skills were valued. In October 1961, Ruth landed what she considered her breakthrough role. Featured dancer in a production of West Side Story at the Riverside Theatre. The Riverside was a beautiful venue, built in 1928 during Chicago's theater boom. It seated 800 people and had hosted everything from vaudeville to legitimate theater to film screenings. By 1961, it was past its prime but still operational, still hosting community theater productions and occasional concerts. Ruth was thrilled. West Side Story was perfect for her. The choreography was demanding, athletic, exactly the kind of dancing she excelled at. And the Riverside Theatre, despite its fading grandeur, still had that magic that comes from decades of performances. Ruth felt at home there. The production was scheduled to open November 10th, 1961. Rehearsals had been underway for 6 weeks. Ruth was there nearly every evening after teaching her daytime classes, practicing the complex choreography, working with the other dancers, falling in love with the theater's history and character. She had a particular fondness for the building itself. The Riverside was a maze of corridors, dressing rooms, storage spaces, and hidden corners. There was a grand staircase leading from the lobby to the balcony. There were ornate plaster decorations on the ceiling. There was a massive chandelier in the main auditorium, and there was the basement level, where props and old costumes were stored, where the ancient boiler rumbled, where the building's mechanical systems lived in shadows and dust. Ruth's fiancé, James Mitchell, understood her passion, but worried about her exhausting schedule. James was 31, an insurance agent with a steady job and practical nature. He and Ruth had been dating for 2 years and engaged for 6 months. They planned to marry in the spring of 1962. "You're wearing yourself out," James told her on the evening of November 2nd, 1961, as Ruth prepared to head to the theater for yet another rehearsal. "You teach all day, then rehearse all night. When do you rest?" "After opening night," Ruth said, kissing him quickly. "Just 1 more week of rehearsals. Then the show runs for 2 weekends, and then I can breathe. I promise." "I'm holding you to that," James said. "We still need to finalize the wedding plans." "We will. Just 7 more days." But Ruth Thompson didn't have 7 more days. She had less than 24 hours. November 3rd, 1961, was a Friday. Ruth taught 3 classes at her studio: a children's ballet class at 9 o'clock a.m., an adult ballroom class at 11 o'clock a.m., and a contemporary dance class for teenagers at 2 o'clock p.m. Her assistant, a 24-year-old dancer named Sarah Wilson, handled the other classes that day. Sarah would later tell investigators that Ruth seemed happy, excited about the upcoming show, perhaps a bit tired, but nothing unusual. At 4:15 p.m., Ruth locked up the studio and walked to where she'd parked her car that morning, a 1958 Chevrolet Bel Air in pale blue. Ruth had recently moved to a small apartment just 6 blocks from her studio in Lincoln Park, choosing convenience over the larger space she could have afforded elsewhere. She drove from the studio toward the Riverside Theatre on the west side, a journey that typically took 25 minutes in Friday afternoon traffic. Ruth arrived at the theater around 4:50 p.m. She parked in the small lot behind the building, in her usual spot near the stage door. The rehearsal wasn't scheduled to start until 7 o'clock p.m., but Ruth often came early to warm up, to practice difficult sections of choreography, to absorb the atmosphere of the theater. The stage door at the rear of the building was unlocked, as it always was during production periods. Ruth entered, called out a greeting to whoever might be around, and made her way to the women's dressing room on the 2nd floor. She changed into her rehearsal clothes, a teal-colored leotard and footless tights, leaving her street clothes, coat, and purse in the dressing room. She stretched, did her usual warm-up routine, and headed down to the stage. At 6:45 p.m., the director, a man named Robert Chen, arrived along with several other cast members. They saw Ruth on stage, practicing a particularly challenging sequence of turns and leaps. "Looking good, Ruth," Robert called out. Ruth waved, caught her breath, and joined the gathering cast. Rehearsal began at 7 o'clock p.m. and ran until 10:30 p.m. It was a productive session. They ran through the entire show once, then focused on problem areas, refining timing and positioning. Ruth was, as always, professional and prepared. When rehearsal ended, Robert thanked everyone and reminded them that tomorrow, Saturday, would be a full dress rehearsal starting at 2 o'clock p.m. This is where the timeline becomes crucial, where every detail would later be examined and re-examined by investigators searching for the moment when everything went wrong. At 10:30 p.m., the cast began gathering their belongings. Ruth went upstairs to the dressing room to change back into her street clothes. Several other dancers went with her, the women talking and laughing, the energy still high from a good rehearsal. But when the other dancers began leaving the dressing room around 10:40 p.m., Ruth was still in her rehearsal clothes, searching through her bag. "Have any of you seen my car keys?" she asked, a note of frustration in her voice. "I know I had them when I came in." The other dancers helped her look for a moment, checking the floor, the chairs, the counter. "Maybe you left them downstairs," one suggested. "Check the stage, or maybe the green room?" "You're probably right," Ruth said. "I'll run down and check. You guys go ahead. See you tomorrow at 2. That was the last time anyone saw Ruth Thompson alive. November 3rd, 1961, 11:30 p.m. James Mitchell was pacing in his apartment, checking his watch for the 20th time. Ruth should have been home by now. Rehearsal typically ended around 10:30, she'd told him. The drive from the theater to her apartment took about 30 minutes. She should have been home by 11:15 at the latest. At 11:45 p.m., James called Ruth's apartment. No answer. He called the Thompson Dance Academy. No answer. He called Ruth's parents in Rogers Park. They hadn't heard from her. Margaret Thompson's voice immediately took on an edge of concern. "Should we be worried?" "I don't know," James said. "Probably not. Maybe rehearsal ran late. Maybe she went out with the cast for a drink. But it's not like her not to call." At midnight, James drove to Ruth's apartment building in Lincoln Park. Her pale blue Chevrolet was not in its assigned parking spot behind the building. That confirmed she hadn't made it home. James felt his anxiety spike into real fear. At 12:30 a.m., now seriously worried, James drove to the Riverside Theatre. The building was dark, locked. He drove around to the back parking lot. Ruth's car was there. It was parked in what appeared to be her regular spot, near the stage door. James pulled up beside it and got out. He tried the driver's door. Locked. He peered through the window. Everything looked normal inside. He couldn't see the keys in the ignition from his angle, but the car was definitely Ruth's. James ran to the stage door and pounded on it. "Ruth! Ruth! Are you in there?" No response. He circled the entire building, looking in windows, calling. Ruth's name. Nothing. Every window was dark. Every door was locked. At 1 a.m., James called the police from a payphone on the corner. The responding officers took his report, but weren't immediately alarmed. A 28-year-old woman, last seen at a theater rehearsal 3 hours ago, her car still at the theater, but she herself missing. "Maybe she got a ride home with someone," one officer suggested. "Maybe car trouble and she's at a garage somewhere. Give it until morning. If she hasn't turned up by then, we'll start looking into it seriously." But morning came with no word from Ruth. At 8 a.m. on November 4th, Saturday, James called the police again. This time they listened. Detective Frank Martinez was assigned to the case. He was 42 years old, a 15-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department with extensive experience in missing persons cases. His first step was to establish Ruth's last known movements. He spoke with Robert Chen, the director, who confirmed Ruth had been at rehearsal until 10:30 p.m. and had seemed perfectly normal. She was in great spirits, Chen said. The show was coming together. She was excited. Nothing was wrong. He spoke with the other dancers who had been in the dressing room with Ruth around 10:40 p.m. They all told the same story. Ruth couldn't find her car keys and thought she might have left them downstairs. They left. She stayed. That was the last they saw of her. Martinez went to the Riverside Theatre on the afternoon of November 4th. The full dress rehearsal had been canceled when word spread that Ruth was missing. The building was quiet except for the theater manager, a man named Gerald Foster, and the night janitor, a 60-year-old man named William Hayes, who had been called in for questioning. "I was here last night," Hayes said, clearly nervous about being questioned by police. "I came in around 11 to start cleaning. That's my usual time on rehearsal nights. I clean after everyone leaves." "Did you see Ruth Thompson?" "No, sir. I saw the tail end of the cast leaving as I arrived, maybe 4 or 5 people heading out the stage door, but I didn't see Miss Thompson specifically." "Did you hear anything unusual? Any sounds? Anyone calling for help?" Hayes hesitated. "Well, I thought I heard maybe some footsteps on the floor above, in the dressing room area around 11:15 or so, but I figured it was just someone who'd forgotten something coming. Back for it. Happens sometimes. I didn't investigate." "Did you hear anything else? Any voices? Any doors closing?" "No, sir. Just those footsteps. Then nothing. I worked until about 2 in the morning, locked up, and went home." Martinez toured the entire theater with Gerald Foster. They checked every room, every dressing space, every storage area. They examined the women's dressing room where Ruth had last been seen. Her purse was there, sitting on a chair. Her coat was hanging on a hook. Her street clothes were folded neatly on the counter. Her car keys were not anywhere in the room. "She said she'd lost her keys," Martinez noted. "So she went looking for them. But where?" They checked the stage, the green room, the prop storage areas, the orchestra pit. Nothing. Then they went to the basement. It was a sprawling, dimly lit space filled with old props, costume racks, broken furniture, and the building's mechanical systems. The boiler room rumbled in one corner. Storage rooms lined. The corridors. The ceiling was low, the lighting poor, the atmosphere oppressive. Martinez and 2 other officers spent 4 hours searching every corner, looking behind every stack of boxes, checking every closet and storage room. They found old scripts, moth-eaten costumes, broken chairs, tools, cleaning supplies. But no Ruth, no car keys, no sign of struggle or disturbance. "It's like she vanished," one officer said, frustrated. On November 5th, Sunday, Detective Martinez brought in police. Dogs. The German shepherds picked up Ruth's scent immediately in the dressing room. They tracked it down the stairs to the stage level, then down another flight of stairs to the basement. The dogs led the handlers through the basement corridors, past the boiler room, toward the far corner near the building's foundation. Then the dogs stopped. They circled an area near the old heating pipes, sniffing intensely, whining in confusion. The handlers encouraged them to continue, but the dogs couldn't pick up the trail beyond that point. "The scent is strong here," the lead handler said, examining the area where the dogs had stopped. "She was definitely here. But then, nothing. The trail just ends. Martinez examined the area carefully. There was nothing unusual visible. Brick walls on two sides, old pipes running along the ceiling, a concrete floor covered in decades of dust. No doors, no openings, no obvious explanation for why the scent trail would end there. Maybe she doubled back, one officer suggested. Maybe she left this area and the scent didn't carry. But the dogs found no other trail. Ruth's scent led to this corner and stopped, as if she'd simply ceased to exist. The investigation intensified. Detective Martinez assembled a detailed timeline. 4:50 p.m., November 3rd, Ruth arrives at theater, parks car 7 o'clock, p.m. to 10:30 p.m., rehearsal 10:40 p.m., last seen in dressing room, looking for car keys, 11 o'clock p.m., William Hayes arrives to clean. 11:15 p.m., Hayes hears footsteps upstairs. 11:30 p.m., Ruth fails to arrive home. 12:30 a.m., November 4th. James finds Ruth's car still at theater. Unknown. Ruth's whereabouts. The police theory was that Ruth had gone to the basement looking for her keys, perhaps thinking she'd left them in one of the storage areas used for costume changes during early rehearsals. But then what? Where did she go from there? Investigators looked closely at William Hayes, the janitor. He had been alone in the building during the critical time window. He had access to every room. Could he have done something to Ruth? Hayes submitted to multiple interviews and a polygraph test, which he passed. His story never changed. He'd arrived at 11 o'clock p.m., heard some footsteps upstairs around 11:15, assumed it was someone from the cast, and began his cleaning routine starting with the basement level. He'd seen and heard nothing else unusual. He'd locked up and left around 2 o'clock a.m. Background checks revealed Hayes had worked at the Riverside for 23 years, had no criminal record, and was known as reliable and quiet. Nothing in his history suggested any capacity for violence. Police investigated Ruth's personal life. Was there anyone who might want to harm her? An ex-boyfriend? A rival? Someone with a grudge? Ruth had dated casually before meeting James, but all her ex-boyfriends were accounted for and had alibis. Her relationships with her dance, students and their parents were uniformly positive. There was no evidence of any conflict, any threat, any reason for someone to target her. James Mitchell was, as always happens in missing person cases, scrutinized carefully. But he had a solid alibi. He'd been at his apartment all evening until 11:30 p.m. when he'd started calling around looking for Ruth. He'd driven to her apartment around midnight, then to the theater around 12:30 a.m., where he'd discovered her car and immediately called police. Multiple witnesses and the timeline confirmed his account, and his distress was clearly genuine. James was devastated. The Chicago newspapers picked up the story. Dancer vanishes after rehearsal. Mystery at Riverside Theatre. Woman's car found, but she's gone. The coverage was extensive. Tips poured in. Police investigated dozens of reported sightings, all of which led nowhere. Detective Martinez kept returning to the basement, to that corner where the dogs had lost Ruth's scent. There had to be something he was missing. Some detail. Some clue. Some explanation. On November 12th, 9 days after Ruth's disappearance, Martinez brought in a structural engineer to examine the basement. "Is there any way," Martinez asked, "that someone could be hidden somewhere in this building that we haven't found? Any crawl spaces, hidden rooms, sealed-off areas?" The engineer examined the building plans from 1928. "Not according to these," he said, "but these are the original plans. If there have been any renovations or modifications since then, there might be discrepancies." Have there been renovations? Gerald Foster, the theater manager, consulted his records. Yes, he said. Major renovations in 1957. The basement was reconfigured to create more storage space. Some walls were added, some removed. Do you have plans from that renovation? Foster searched his files but came up empty. The construction company that did the work was Midwestern Builders. They went out of business around 1959, I think. Their records would have... I don't know where they'd be now. Martinez made a note to track down any surviving records from the 1957 renovation, but it was a long shot. Still, it was something. By December 1961, 1 month after Ruth's disappearance, the investigation had reached a dead end. Ruth Thompson had simply vanished. Her family held a vigil at the theater, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. James appeared on television, his voice breaking, begging Ruth to come home if she could, begging anyone who knew anything to contact police. The Riverside Theatre continued operations, but the cast of West Side Story couldn't bring themselves to perform without Ruth. The production was canceled. The theater limped along for another 2 years, hosting occasional community events, but attendance dropped. People felt uncomfortable in the Eid building where a woman had vanished without explanation. In 1963, the Riverside Theatre closed its doors permanently. The building was locked, boarded up, left to decay. Ruth Thompson was declared legally dead in 1968, 7 years after her disappearance. Her family held a memorial service with an empty casket. James Mitchell attended, standing silently in the back, his face gray with grief. He never married. Years later, friends would say that James Mitchell had died the same night Ruth vanished, even if his body kept living for another 38 years. Detective Frank Martinez retired from the Chicago Police Department in 1974, 13 years after Ruth's disappearance. The case had haunted him throughout his career. He'd never stopped thinking about it, never stopped wondering what he'd missed. In his retirement, he kept all his notes and files on the case, still hoping that someday, somehow, an answer would emerge. For 15 years, the mystery remained unsolved. Ruth Thompson had walked into the Riverside Theatre on November 3, 1961, and simply ceased to exist. Her purse and street clothes remained in the dressing room for months until her family finally retrieved them. Her car sat in the theater's parking lot until it was eventually towed and returned to her parents, who couldn't bear to sell it. It sat in their garage, covered with a tarp, a monument to their missing daughter. The Riverside Theatre stood abandoned through the 1960s and into the 1970s. Vandals broke in occasionally. The homeless sometimes found shelter there. Local teenagers told stories about the place being haunted, about hearing footsteps on the empty stage, about a ghostly dancer sometimes seen in the windows. But these were just stories, weren't they? In 1975, the city condemned the building. It was structurally unsound, an eyesore, a hazard. Demolition was scheduled for April 1976. A local developer had purchased the property and planned to build apartments. No one expected the demolition crew to find anything, certainly not a missing dancer who had vanished 15 years earlier, certainly not the answer to one of Chicago's most persistent mysteries. But on April 12, 1976, in the basement of the Riverside Theatre, the truth finally came to light. The 15 years between Ruth Thompson's disappearance and the discovery of her body were marked by gradual acceptance of a mystery that would never be solved. Ruth's parents, Patrick and Margaret Thompson, aged rapidly under the weight of not knowing. Margaret died in 1970, her death certificate listing heart failure. But everyone who knew her understood that she'd died of a broken heart. Patrick followed in 1974. Neither ever learned what happened to their youngest daughter. Ruth's older brother, Thomas, became obsessed with finding answers. He hired private investigators. He personally searched abandoned buildings around the theater. He followed up on every rumor, every supposed sighting, every psychic who claimed to know where Ruth was. Nothing led anywhere. By 1976, Thomas was 50 years old, divorced, having sacrificed his marriage and career to an obsession he couldn't let go. Ruth's sister, Catherine, took a different path. She tried to move on, to build a life, to accept that Ruth was gone and would never be found. She married, had children, moved to the suburbs, but she thought about Ruth every day. Every single day for 15 years. James Mitchell never recovered. Friends and family tried to encourage him to date, to move forward, to find happiness. But James couldn't. Ruth had been his future, and without her, he had no future. He went through the motions of living, working his insurance job, maintaining his apartment, existing but not truly alive. By 1976, he was 46 years old, gray-haired, looking 15 years older than his actual age. The Riverside Theatre, meanwhile, slowly crumbled. The beautiful Art Deco facade that had once been maintained with pride now showed cracks and water damage. The marquee, which had once announced shows in bright lights, hung askew, several letters missing. Windows were broken. The roof leaked. Inside, water damage had warped the wooden floors, and mold grew on the walls. The grand chandelier that Ruth had loved still hung in the auditorium, but several crystals had fallen, shattering on the floor below. The building became a cautionary tale about urban decay, about how quickly beauty can turn to rot when nobody cares enough to maintain it. Preservationists argued that the Riverside should be restored, that it was a historic landmark. But the cost was too high, the building too far gone. In 1975, the city made the practical decision: demolish it. The demolition contract went to Midwestern Demolition Company. The crew chief was a man named Robert Lawson, a 35-year-old veteran of the demolition business. He'd torn down hundreds of buildings in his career, from houses to factories to office towers. An old theater was nothing special. The work began on April 8, 1976. The crew started from the top, carefully removing hazardous materials, then systematically tearing down the structure level by level. By April 12th, they had reached the equipe basement level. The basement was a warren of rooms and corridors, much more extensive than the upper floors. There were old dressing rooms down here, storage spaces, the boiler room, mechanical rooms, and numerous spaces whose original purpose was unclear. The demolition crew had to carefully map everything before they could safely proceed. Around 2:30 p.m. on April 12th, crew member Marcus Webb was using a sledgehammer to break through a basement wall that was scheduled for removal. The wall separated two storage areas and appeared to be a later addition to the building, possibly added during renovations in the 1940s or 50s to subdivide space. Marcus swung the hammer, breaking through plaster and lath. On his third swing, the sledgehammer went completely through the wall, and Marcus felt it hit something on the other side. Not the far wall. Something else. Something soft. He pulled the hammer back and peered through the hole. It was dark on the other side. He shone his flashlight through the opening. "Oh, God," Marcus said, stepping back quickly. "Robert, get over here, now!" Robert Lawson hurried over. "What's wrong?" There's something in there, behind this wall. I think it might be a body." Robert looked through the hole. He saw what Marcus had seen. A small space, perhaps 6 feet by 8 feet, with no door, no windows, no apparent access. And in the corner, slumped against the wall, were human remains. The demolition stopped immediately. Robert called 911 at 2:47 p.m. Chicago police arrived within 15 minutes, followed shortly by detectives and the medical examiner. Detective Sarah Martinez was assigned to the case. She was 32 years old, daughter of retired Detective Frank Martinez. She'd grown up hearing about the Ruth Thompson case. Her father had told her about it numerous times throughout her childhood and teenage years. It had been the case that haunted him, the one he could never solve, the missing woman he'd never found. Sarah stood in the basement of the Riverside Theatre, staring at the hole in the wall, feeling a strange sense of recognition. Could this be related to her father's case? The timing was right. The location was exact. But how could Ruth Thompson have been here all along, just feet from where police had searched? The wall was carefully demolished to allow access to the hidden space. Crime scene technicians documented everything with photographs and measurements. The space was indeed small, roughly 6 by 8 feet, with brick walls on 3 sides and the plaster wall on the 4th. There was no door, no window, no way in or out except through the wall that the demolition crew had broken. The remains were in the far corner, partially mummified by the dry conditions of the sealed space. The body was sitting upright, legs drawn up, arms wrapped around the knees. The clothing was remarkably preserved, a teal-colored leotard, and footless tights, the kind dancers wore. Beside the body was a woman's flat shoe, simple and practical, suitable for rehearsal. Near the body, investigators found other items, several hairpins, still holding a few strands of auburn hair. And scratched into the brick wall, in desperate, uneven letters, were words that made the investigators' blood run cold. "Help me, please, am trapped. Can't get out. Please, someone." Below these messages, scratched more deeply into the mortar, were what appeared to be tally marks. The investigators counted them. 14 marks, 14 days. The remains were carefully removed and transported to the medical examiner's office. Detective Sarah Martinez immediately pulled the file on Ruth Thompson's 1961 disappearance. The description matched: auburn hair, slender build, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall. Last seen wearing rehearsal clothes, a teal leotard. Dental records were obtained from Ruth Thompson's dentist, who had miraculously maintained records going back to the 1950s. The comparison was conclusive. These were the remains of Ruth Thompson, missing since November 3, 1961, found 15 years later, less than 50 feet from where she was last seen alive. The discovery made national news. Dancer found after 15 years. Tragic end to Chicago mystery. The story captured public attention because it was so unusual, so tragic, and because it raised an obvious question. How does someone become trapped in a sealed room? Detective Sarah Martinez called her father immediately. Frank Martinez, now 65 and retired, drove to the theater. He stood in the basement, looking at the hidden room that had been behind a wall all along, and wept. "I searched this basement," he said, his voice breaking. "I was right here. I was standing right here, and she was just on the other side of this wall. I didn't know. I didn't know." The answer required architectural investigation. The Cook County Medical Examiner brought in a structural engineer and an architectural historian to examine the building's construction history. What they discovered was a tragedy of timing negligence, and terrible luck. The Riverside Theatre had been extensively renovated in 1957, 4 years before Ruth's disappearance. During that renovation, the basement had been reconfigured. Several walls had been added to create new storage spaces. The work had been done by Midwestern Builders, a small construction company that had gone out of business in 1959. One of the new walls had been built directly in front of an old access door that led to a small mechanical room. The room had originally housed electrical panels and was accessed infrequently, only when specific repairs were needed. During the 1957 renovation, the electrical system had been updated and the panels moved to a different location. The old mechanical room was no longer needed. The construction crew, working quickly and cheaply, had simply built a wall in front of the old door rather than properly sealing and documenting the abandoned space. They'd plastered over the door, painted the wall, and moved on. The mechanical room still existed behind the new wall, but its existence was not recorded on any updated building plans. Worse still, the construction company had disposed of most of its project documentation when it went out of business in 1959. The detailed plans showing the sealed room had been lost or destroyed. On November 3, 1961, Ruth Thompson had been searching for her car keys. She'd gone to the basement, systematically checking the storage areas. In the dim basement light, while examining a wall in the far corner, she'd noticed something. Perhaps a slight gap in the plaster. Perhaps the faint outline of a door frame. Perhaps paint that looked different from the surrounding wall. Ruth had pushed on. Curious. The plaster, old and weakened by years of basement dampness, had given way. Behind it was the old door. Its paint bubbled and cracked. When Ruth pushed harder, the door had opened. She'd stepped inside to look. The room was small and empty except for some old conduit and abandoned mounting brackets where electrical panels had once been. Her keys weren't there, but as long as she was checking everywhere. And then, as Ruth was examining the small space, the door had swung shut behind her. The door had no handle on the inside. It had been designed to be opened only from outside, as maintenance doors often were. When it closed, Ruth was trapped. The forensic evidence told the rest of the story. Ruth had survived approximately 14 days in that sealed room, as indicated by the tally marks she'd scratched into the wall. The basement temperature in November would have been around 50 degrees, cold but not immediately fatal. But Ruth was wearing only her rehearsal clothes, a thin leotard, and tights. No coat, no layers, and she had no water, no food, no way to stay warm. The medical examiner's report concluded that Ruth had died of dehydration, hypothermia, and exposure. The combination of cold temperatures, no water, and extreme stress had shut down her body systems over the course of 2 weeks. The most heartbreaking details were in the evidence on the walls. Ruth had used her hairpins to scratch messages into the brick. She had written, "Help me," multiple times. She had scratched at the door, trying to force it open. The wood showed gouges where she'd attempted to dig through with her bare hands and the metal ends of her hairpins. Ruth had also tried to break through the brick wall. Several bricks near the door showed scratch marks and small indentations where she'd repeatedly struck them with her shoe, hoping to create an opening large enough to be seen or heard through. But the walls were solid brick, 18 inches thick. The door was solid oak, designed for security. And the room was deep in the basement, surrounded by other storage areas beneath the stage. Even if Ruth had screamed for hours, which she certainly had, the sound wouldn't have carried beyond the basement level. William Hayes, the janitor, had been in the basement on the night of November 3rd, starting his cleaning routine around 11 o'clock p.m. But he'd been in the boiler room area, at least 50 feet away, with the old boiler rumbling loudly. He never heard Ruth's desperate calls for help. The police dogs in 1961 had tracked Ruth's scent to the corner of the basement and lost the trail because Ruth's scent had led to the hidden door, which was only a few feet from where the dogs had stopped. But the door was so well concealed, plastered over and painted to match the surrounding wall, that no one had realized it was there. The dogs had detected Ruth's scent at the wall, but couldn't track through 18 inches of solid brick. Detective Frank Martinez's instinct had been correct. Ruth had been in the basement. The evidence had been there, but the hidden room, created by careless renovation and poor documentation, had turned a storage space into a tomb. For 15 years, Ruth Thompson had been exactly where police had searched. She'd been in the basement of the Riverside Theatre, trapped behind a wall that shouldn't have existed, in a room that appeared on no plans, dying alone in the dark while rescue stood just feet away. The discovery of Ruth Thompson's body in April 1976 brought closure to a 15-year mystery, but that closure came with profound grief and anger. Ruth hadn't been murdered. She hadn't run away. She hadn't suffered a sudden medical emergency. She had been the victim of careless construction, of cutting corners, of contractors who had sealed a room without ensuring no one could accidentally become trapped inside. The Cook County Medical Examiner issued his final report in June 1976. Cause of death: dehydration and hypothermia. Manner of death: accidental. Time of death: estimated between November 17th and November 20th, 1961, approximately 2 weeks after Ruth was last seen. But that word, accidental, seemed inadequate to describe a tragedy so preventable, so utterly avoidable. Criminal investigation followed. Who was responsible for the 1957 renovation that had created the death trap? Midwestern Builders had gone out of business in 1959. The contractor who had overseen the work, a man named Leonard Foster, had died in 1972. The foreman on the project had moved to California and couldn't be located. The building's owner in 1957 had sold the property in 1960 and was now 83 years old, living in a nursing home with advanced dementia. There was no one to hold accountable, no one to prosecute, no one to sue, no one to blame. The people responsible were dead, disappeared, or incapacitated. The company was long defunct. The tragedy simply was irreversible and unpunishable. Ruth Thompson was finally laid to rest on June 18, 1976, in a funeral that drew over 300 people. James Mitchell was there, now 46, but looking 60. He stood at the graveside, silent, tears streaming down his face. After the service, he spoke briefly to a reporter. For 15 years, I hoped she was alive somewhere. Hoped maybe she'd lost her memory or been taken somewhere, but that she was alive. Knowing she was there the whole time, that we searched that building and she was just behind a wall, that she died alone while we were looking for her. This is worse than any other answer could have been. Thomas Thompson, Ruth's brother, spoke at the funeral. My sister survived for 2 weeks in that room. 2 weeks. She scratched messages into walls. She fought to stay alive. And we were up there, above her, and we didn't know. We searched and searched, and we didn't know she was right there. His voice broke, and he couldn't continue. Detective Frank Martinez attended the funeral, but didn't speak. He stood in the back, bearing the weight of 15 years of failure. Sarah Martinez stood beside her father, holding his arm, knowing that no words could ease his pain. The tragedy led to immediate changes in Chicago's building codes. The City Council passed the Ruth Thompson Safety Act in August 1976, requiring comprehensive architectural documentation before any building renovation. Any space being sealed or closed off must be thoroughly inspected and documented. Any doors being covered must be verified as having no interior access or release mechanism. Building inspectors must physically check every space before issuing approval. All building modifications must be recorded with the city, and updated plans must be filed within 30 days of completion. Similar laws were adopted in cities across the country. Theater safety became a particular focus. Backstage areas, basements, mechanical spaces, all had to be clearly mapped and regularly inspected. Emergency exit signs and lighting became mandatory in all areas where people might work or pass through. No more hidden rooms, no more forgotten doors, no more death traps. Ruth's dance studio, Thompson Dance Academy, had closed in 1962, a year after her disappearance. The space sat vacant for years until a new tenant finally moved in. But in 1977, a group of Ruth's former students, now adults, raised funds to place a plaque at the location. Thompson Dance Academy, 1955 to 1962. Founded by Ruth Thompson, disappeared November 3, 1961. Found April 12, 1976. Dance teacher, performer, beloved friend. Her grace lives on in all who knew her. The Riverside Theatre site became a small memorial park. The developer who had purchased the property donated a portion of it to the city after Ruth's body was discovered. A bronze statue of a dancer was placed there in 1978, with a plaque reading, "In memory of Ruth Thompson, 1933 to 1961, and all lost to preventable tragedy. May we build safer spaces." James Mitchell visited the memorial every week until his death in 1994 at age 64. He never married. He never truly moved on. Friends said that James had died in that theater in 1961, even if his body continued living for another 33 years. When he passed, his will requested that his ashes be scattered at the memorial park. His final wish was to be with Ruth. Detective Frank Martinez died in 1985 at age 74. His obituary mentioned his 43-year career with the Chicago Police Department, but those who knew him well understood that the Ruth Thompson case had defined him more than any other. His daughter Sarah, who continued as a detective until her retirement in 2001, kept her father's original case file in her office as a reminder of how the smallest oversight can lead to the greatest tragedies. The case of Ruth Thompson remains one of Chicago's most tragic mysteries, not because of what happened, but because of how easily it could have been prevented. Ruth didn't need to die. She needed someone to properly document a renovation. She needed a door with an interior handle. She needed construction workers who didn't cut corners. She needed building codes that prioritized safety over speed. She needed luck. She didn't get any of those things. Instead, she got 15 years of being lost while being exactly where people were looking. 15 years of being mourned while her body remained undiscovered, just feet away from where searchers had stood, calling her name into the darkness. Ruth Thompson fought to survive in that sealed room. She kept herself alive for 2 weeks through sheer will. She scratched messages into walls, hoping against hope that someone would find them. She marked the days, maintaining sanity through routine even as her body failed. She didn't give up. Even when all hope was gone, Ruth Thompson didn't surrender. But hope isn't enough when you're trapped behind 18 inches of brick. And will isn't enough when you have no water and the temperature drops to 50 degrees every night. And fighting isn't enough when no one knows where to look. The Riverside Theatre is gone now, demolished in 1976 after Ruth's body was recovered. The site transformed into a memorial park where children play and families picnic, unaware of the tragedy that occurred beneath their feet. The building that had been Ruth's passion, her stage, her second home, had become her tomb. And for 15 years, it kept its secret. But buildings don't keep secrets forever. Eventually, walls come down. Eventually, truth emerges. And when it did, Ruth Thompson finally came home. Her story changed laws. Her tragedy prevented others. Her death, though it came 15 years too late to save her, may have saved countless others from similar fates. That's small comfort to those who loved her, but it's something. It's a legacy, however painful. Ruth Thompson wanted to dance. She wanted to perform. She wanted to bring grace and beauty to the world. And in a way, she did. Not through her performances, which ended far too soon, but through the changes her death inspired, through the laws that bear her name, through the memorial that reminds us to build carefully, to document thoroughly, to prioritize safety over convenience. She wanted to be remembered, and she is, not just as a victim, but as a catalyst for change, not just as a tragedy, but as a lesson learned, not just as a missing woman, but as Ruth Thompson, dancer, teacher, daughter, sister, fiancée, friend. A woman who deserved so much, more than she got. A woman who fought until the end. A woman who was lost for 15 years, but who, finally, came home.